Hello everyone! Welcome to Reacting Reddit, where real humans react and respond to content on Reddit. Today, I picked a topic comparing the riots and protests of 2020, and now 2021, to 1968. This question asked people who were alive back in 1968 and kind of remember it, how it compares to what 2020 is like in the US. Because if you're not privy to the U.S. or you don't live there, well, 2020's had a lot of protests. I can't really sum everything up. I'm assuming you'll know about it. But a lot of people thought that 2020 would be the end of that. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like that's the case, as in 2021, in the very beginning of the year, the capital of the U.S. was stormed, literally stormed. Senators had to leave in gas masks. And I will say there is a little bit of bitter irony here in that senators had to leave in gas masks from pepper spray and tear gas that was being used by both sides. And also, this was a mob of white people, and only one person got shot, which really adds insult to injury of all of the protesting of 2020 and all the black people who were killed. Because everybody knows that if all these people who just stormed the Capitol building while government employees were working, if that mob of people had been black, there would have been way more shootings than just one person. And so it really just brings all the racial inequality right back front and center. So let's see what does Reddit have to say about this highly controversial, intense, and quite overwhelming subject. This reply is by UGameProf. I was a kid in Washington, D.C. in the 1960s. We saw many protests and got caught in a tear gas cloud at least once. This is much worse. Not the protests and the riots. We've had worse before and since then. And in most ways, the racial tensions aren't nearly as bad as they were before. But the brazen political corruption has surpassed Nixon. And more people in general seem primed for angry protest, even violence. We really haven't been where we are now, this since at least the late 1850s. I don't agree with that. I definitely don't agree that the government is more corrupt than it was 170 years ago. I'm not saying it's not corrupt now, but from my understanding, it's been corrupt the entire time, and we're just more aware of that now. Like, nowadays, the average person in the U.S. knows that the U.S. committed war crimes and that the CIA has tortured people. 50 years ago, they'd be like, no, we're the good guys. Our government doesn't do that. So I as a foreigner who wasn't raised inside the US, I personally don't agree that it's more corrupt now than it was hundreds of years ago. I think that the corruption is existing and in very much the same ways as it did. The difference is that regular people are far more educated now. Way more educated than they ever used to be. Right now, at this moment, you listening to this, you have as much information accessible to you as a person in 1850 had their entire lives. You can get all the information they had access to in 40 years or 50 years. You can get that in literally a day online now. We are way more educated than we used to be. And in turn, we are also more aware of how our governments fuck us over and fuck other people over. That doesn't mean that the governments are doing more corrupt things now. I think it's more likely that the governments in general have fluctuating levels of corruption, but all have some form of corruption. Like a lot of you guys, if you live in the USA, you'll probably be like, oh yeah, it's corrupt here, but it's not like in Latin America where you can bribe a cop to get away with your crime. And yeah, that's true. I live in Nicaragua. And if you get in trouble, but you didn't murder someone, you didn't do something intense, let's say you got a ticket or you got caught drinking and driving, or you got caught with some weed or something, you can bribe the cop 500 Cordoba, which is about $20, and usually get off with the crime without being charged, okay? That's corruption, right? But can you really argue that that's more corrupt than being able to kill someone in a DUI accident where you were drunk and then you pay lawyers $300,000 and end up getting off with nothing? Like, do you really think that's less corrupt? Like, yeah, okay, maybe in Latin America it's more obviously corrupt, but that doesn't mean that you can't use money to overcome the law in the United States. That absolutely happens. The difference is that in the US, it's really expensive. So the people who are using money to overcome law tend to be really rich because no one else can afford it. It doesn't mean that there's not corruption. It just means that the corruption is different, right? It shows itself differently. I really, sorry, I know I ranted a bit there, but I really want to hammer home the point that it isn't wise to think that, oh, we're more corrupt now, when you have no way to know how corrupt it was before, because that would mean you know all the secrets of the government, which you don't. So there's literally no way for you to know if that's true. So it's really dumb for us to compare eras and be like, yeah, this time was more corrupt because of my personal opinions and lack of information. You know, we really can't make those distinctions. For me, it makes a lot more sense to just assume it's always been corrupt. And we're just more aware, so we're seeing more of the corruption. But that doesn't mean that it's there and it wasn't there before. People were just more ignorant before, that's all. Jippy Zippy Lippy says, agreed. This isn't radicals against the man. This is the president giving right-wing radicals tacit permission to harass, injure, and kill other citizens who are peacefully, in most cases, protesting as in their legal right. It's two very different ideologies clashing in the streets in major cities. It's not decided geographically. There's no leadership except mayors and governors, and each state is differently led. It sure is a shit show. No matter what the outcome, I cannot wait until this cancerous presidency is over with, and the orange turd is nothing more than a bad memory. Hey, now, like, you can't be blaming everything on Trump, because I hate to break it to you, but at some point Trump's not going to be president anymore, and we're still going to have problems, guys. So, like, yeah, I get it. If you don't like him, whatever. But eventually, if all you do is talk crap about a person, say how they fuck up all the time, eventually it doesn't really do anything for you. You're just another person talking shit about another politician, right? It's better to try and understand things. And what's interesting about these comments is these are actually made before the event I just told you about in the Capitol. So the event in the Capitol was quite interesting because it was a mob of white people attacking the most important building in the United States, which didn't really happen before. We had these like groups of people fighting each other in these protests and riots. There were people taking advantage of the chaos and stealing stuff, but you didn't have like a targeted attack on a building by a whole mass of people. You know, it's a very, very unique event. Dr. Boot Up says Trump is probably the most corrupt president in history. Nixon was unethical, but at least he had... No, screw that! No, you don't know anything about Nixon if you're thinking that Trump is worse than Nixon. Nixon had to do with the war on drugs. He had to do with the Vietnam War. Nixon was literally in charge of loads of people unnecessarily dying. And to this day, the crisis in Latin America is fueled by the drug war that the United States wages. So... I'm sorry, but Trump's not that big of a deal. Trump hasn't caused 30 years of death, misery, and suffering. So I get that he's recent and you're angry at him and he sucks. That's fine, whatever. You can say what you want. But to say he's worse than Nixon is really bad. Nixon didn't just try and steal an election. Nixon scapegoated entire, like basically drugs are illegal because Nixon's administration needed a way to suppress minorities, and a lot of minorities happened to smoke weed. So it was very convenient for them to illegalize weed to get them to put the minorities in jail to fuel their racism. Like, if you really think that Trump is worse than Nixon, that means you don't know anything about the Vietnam War, And it means that you think that the only thing Nixon did was Watergate. Watergate was like, that was the public thing. Yeah, he tried to steal an election, wiretaps, That is nothing compared to the long-term effects of the war on drugs, how many people have been jailed when they didn't need to be, and the whole industry that fueled all of the drug creation in Latin America, all these cartels. These places, these groups exist because drugs are illegal in the United States, but there's demand for them, so they're going to be manufactured, but they can't be manufactured legally in the United States, so of course they're manufactured in the countries where tons of the base ingredients are really easy to get and labor's really cheap. If the United States didn't have illegal drugs and they were manufacturing their own stuff and figuring out their own problems, then Latin America wouldn't be as violent. You cannot even put a number on how many people have been killed or fled or seen their families die in front of them because of things that Nixon was a part of. So I will not tolerate that at all. I don't like Trump or Nixon, but I definitely like Trump a lot more than Nixon. Absolutely. We haven't been alive to see the long enough effects of Trump, and it doesn't look like he's put us into a war. We have conflict here in our own country, but honestly, that's better than us going over with the best military technology in the world and fighting people who have to use guerrilla tactics who we can never actually beat because we aren't fighting armies anymore, because we're invading other countries, going places where people don't want us with our fancy military technology, forcing them to have to fight against us in the only way that's possible because they don't have the military power and they can't resign, they can't give up. So, of course, it forces them to do horrible things. There is no way to fight against the best, military technology in the world without blowing up children and using, side shisty tactics like this. Life is not as simple as you think it is. If you really think that Trump is the worst president in history, that's, oh man, that comment, that got me turned. Bicycle Mom says, at first, earlier in the year, I would have said that 1968 was way worse. I mean, we ended up having an assassination of a Democratic contender to the presidency and a leader in the Black civil rights movement, a lot of rioting, and a pretty bad war. But 2020 is pretty damn bad, and worse by a lot of standards. The economy is certainly worse. A lot more people are out of work, and we have a pandemic raging and rioting. The political discourse is pretty bad. The internet has given every asshole a microphone and camera, so crap opinions and fake news abound. I'm gonna call it a draw. I'd like to forget either year happened. Hey, comments like this are way more reasonable because they're like, hey, there's arguments either way, and it's really hard to tell the difference. I will say that right now, so just so you know, if you think COVID is over or you're one of those people who are like, oh, yeah, 2020 is happening, now there's this vaccine, well, we're losing up to 3,000 people. Wait, let me double check here. Let's go look at this graph again. Oh, I was wrong, actually. On the 6th of January, the U.S. lost 3,964 people to COVID. And if you don't know much about death, let me give you some context. Largest causes of death in the USA are heart disease and cancer. But guess what? These things, they kill way less than a couple thousand people per day. Let's see. So cancer... Both cancer and heart disease basically kill 600,000 people. Heart disease kills 655,000 people a year, roughly, whereas cancer kills 600,000 people a year, okay? So let's take these COVID statistics, right? Let's go look at this graph again. Okay, this is 4,000. Previously, that was like 2,000 or 3,000 something. So let's take an average, because it peaks, right? Because of the way that scheduling and posting these things works. In reality, the actual number is like midway in between all of the peaks and waves, right? So it would look something like that, okay? So let's say that in reality, okay, that's around 3,000. So let's say there's only 1,500 people dying per day of COVID. knowing that actually on the worst days, it's over double that. If it's 1,500 people per day times 365, that is almost exactly as much as people are dying to cancer, okay? And that's at the 1,500 point. So the 1,600 deaths per day is cancer and heart disease, cancer or heart disease, basically. So when you are getting metrics of 3,000 people dying every single day, that is more death than the leading cause of death before. So if you didn't think that COVID was serious, or you didn't think that it was going into 2021, that's okay. I don't mind if, you have an opinion about that. You're entitled to your opinion. What I want you to understand is that COVID is killing more people than the number 1 and number 2 causes of death. COVID is the number 1 killer right now. That's a reality. And it adds so much complication to all this stuff going on. It really does. You can't underestimate that. Moving on. Let's see if we can get a better... I want to find a comment that really goes more into detail of what it was like in 1968, but I guess we don't have a whole lot of people who use Reddit and who want to remember vividly, right? Because, I mean, if you were alive and remembering things in 1968, let's say you were 15 in 1968, 1968 was 52 years ago, so we would need to find people in their 70s who remember this. Spuslush says, 1968 scared the living hell out of me, but I think 2020 is going to be much worse, and I really am afraid of what's to come next year. I think the groundwork is being laid for a truly terrifying future. If I were 40 years younger, I'd be in the streets, but I'm just a crippled old man watching it from the stands, fearing the worst and hoping for the best. All right. King of Knife says, it's okay. You can rest assured we care. The torch has been passed to stand up for what's right. Well, I don't know, because this guy could be like, yeah, I'm fighting for what's right, and I just went in, tried to get into the Capitol building while it was in session and got shot. Or, maybe this is a person who peacefully went to a Black Lives Matter protest and was talking about police violence against black people. I feel like one's way more redeeming than the other, but, who knows? Young people, we tend to get very up and armed and emotional and kind of act like nobody's ever been up in arms and emotional and no one was ever young before. Huh. Oh, look at this. Oh, I already know. I already agree with this person, even though it's just the first sentence. Here we go, Xleb. Spread some of your wisdom upon us. In my opinion, there is no comparing the American 1960s to now because there is no Vietnam War. That war was so widely unpopular with the public in general that it united the diverse sides in opposition to it. I think there is nothing like that right now. This is not the 1960s. We are in different times, and perhaps another rendition of revolutionary times. But the 1960s was not a comparable contrast. This is not the same. There is no unifying, opposing ideology. Yeah, I guess that's a good point because, you might even argue that COVID on a worldwide scale has brought the world together because all of these governments had to coordinate and work together against this unseen enemy. However, in the United States, COVID definitely hasn't been like, oh yeah, Republicans weren't like, yeah, this is the thing we agree with. Democrats, let's work together to fight COVID. And Democrats weren't like, yeah, this is the thing we agree with. Republicans, let's work together to fight COVID. Nah, they didn't do that. They made it all politicized and made it all controversial. And now how you feel about COVID has something to do with your political affiliation, which is so dumb because it's a disease that floats through the air. It doesn't care, it really doesn't care. And what's so funny? I'm sitting here living in Nicaragua, in this third world country, as you living in the US would probably think. And, you go to the market here, guess what you see? You see like half the people wearing masks. And I want you to understand, this is the second poorest country in the hemisphere, a lot of people still feel like they should wear a mask, okay? And that's how it is in a lot of countries, but for some reason in the US, it's like, oh, no, if you're Democrat, then you wear masks. And if you're Republican, you usually don't wear masks. And it's like, what? That's so dumb. It's so dumb. Oh my God. Sigh. Moving on. Ubitua says, there's no Vietnam War, but we've been engaged in an endless war in the Middle East for an entire adult generation. Yeah, it's true. It's absolutely true that the U.S. has been waging war in the Middle East, but you should understand the differences between the Vietnam War and the Middle East. Basically, there was never another action. If you look at war as a lot of loss of human life, right? And you look at a greedy perspective, let's just say from the U.S.'s perspective, the Vietnam War was the last war where a lot of U.S. soldiers died. If you look at death statistics for the U.S. in all of these Middle Eastern wars, barely any U.S. soldiers ever die. It's like really rare compared to previous wars, but that wasn't true in the Vietnam War. Let's look up some war death statistics, okay? We're gonna look at USA soldier death. Vietnam War, okay? Right, let's find just some, okay, National Archives here. Vietnam War contains records of 58,200 U.S. military fatal casualties in the Vietnam War. Okay, let's put aside the facts that this doesn't include civilians, doesn't include complications, doesn't include like vets coming home and committing suicide or dying to alcohol poisoning, right? It doesn't, none of that. We're just talking literally, okay, how many U.S. military deaths are on the U.S.'s records for the Vietnam War? It's, let's say, 58,000. It's 58,220, okay? Now, if you look at the Middle East, okay? USA death, Middle East. We're comparing to the Vietnam War, right? Vietnam War, let's say it was 58,000 deaths, and, whoa, the Vietnam War was 20 years? I didn't realize it was so long. Wow. That's amazing. I thought it was way shorter than that. 1955 to 1975? Jeez. 19 years. But what about the most intense part, though? Interesting. All right, but I'm getting distracted here. We need to see, okay, so over 20 years, roughly 60,000 documented military death, when actually it's more than that. And that's not including the Vietnamese people, right? We're just talking about from the U.S. perspective. So let's go look at the Middle Eastern wars. Let's look at USA soldier death in Middle East. So we're comparing 60,000 to, all right, in 2002, 480. In 2004, 840. 2005, 850. Okay, so in the between 2004 and 2004 and 2007, there was way more death, right? But you're still only talking about less than 1,000 people per year, okay? The Vietnam War, over 20 years, was killing around 4,000 U.S. soldiers per year, okay? That's literally over 5 times as deadly as the years between 2004 and 2009. It's true. I don't want to support the U.S.'s wage warring culture and how it has waged wars in the Middle East. I'm not trying to rectify that, but I'm just pointing out to you that you can't compare the Vietnam War to the wars in the Middle East, because they're very fundamentally different. They're not the same thing. The Vietnam War, there was a draft. U.S. soldiers were being sent to their deaths, okay? And they didn't want to die. They were just regular people who were forced to fight. That was ended, right? So let's look at the history of the draft in the USA. Okay? So the draft started 1940 and ended in 1973 when the Vietnam War ended. So while it's true that we still have war in the United States against other countries, if you look at death of U.S. citizens, one, way less U.S. citizens are dying in war. Way less. However, unfortunately, that isn't true for the other sides. Way less U.S. citizens are dying in war, but they're volunteers now. So you have to understand, not only were they not volunteers, not only were more people dying, it was completely different. Now the wars are volunteered, and we lose less than 1,000 people per year. And most of the time it's less than it's 8. In 2020 military deaths in Middle East, or USA military deaths, right? So this, is 2021. Jeez, that's a lot. Oh, but that's everything. Okay, this is the wrong report. Okay, U.S. troops, 93, 2020. All right, so 100 people, right? Remember, in the Vietnam War, it was an average of 4,000 people per year, and that's averaged out over 20 years. The reality is that the most intense period of death was way shorter than that. And way more people than 4,000 were dying. And guess what? They were forced to fight. You cannot compare the Vietnam War to the stuff in the Middle East. It's just not accurate at all. Moving on. All right. Swiggy 1957 says, the main reason why the war was so unpopular was the draft. Last I heard, we're still fighting in Afghanistan. I'm not sure if we have troops in Iraq still. I know Gitmo is still open. Thinking about it, the race riots of the era and comparing them to the protests of today, I have to wonder if there were racist instigators involved in sparking riots. I'm pretty sure the Chicago riots, especially during the DNC convention, had paid instigators just to give police a reason to use force. Oh, that brings a whole other topic that hasn't come up in the US, but let me tell you a little bit about Nicaragua. So here, Nicaragua, the cost of living is very, very, very low. You can live a pretty good life off $500 a month here, okay? And there's political upheaval, right? So there was a protest, and basically, imagine you have money, and imagine you want to cause some chaos. For $4,000 or $5,000, you can convince somebody to try and shoot a cop. For the small price of $4,000 or $5,000, you can pit citizens against their people and convince the citizens that a cop just killed one of them and convince the cop that a citizen just shot one of them. It's really effed, and you would be surprised how often something like that happens. We see a protest, and as the common people, we think that there's a reason, a specific reason that protest started. But there often actually is some provoker who knows that if they put a bullet in the right place at the right time, it's going to cause two forces to fight each other. Oh my God, after saying that, I just realized that's the US's entire policy on foreign policy. Wow. Whew. Sorry, I'm a bit bitter against the US, as you guys who watch these videos can probably tell. I've spent too much time overseas living in the countries that the US set up governments in, and there's been a lot of problems. I personally believe that technology was going to save the world, and the US didn't need to try and force democracy upon everybody. That was going to happen inevitably once technology made social media allowed humans to share their experience with other humans all over the world. We don't live in the world we live in today because democracy won. We live in the world we live in today because technology won. And humans were forced to be more accountable because of things like video recording and this kind of stuff. We need more accountability, but my personal belief is that our utopian society, right? Like the point we want to get to is a society where everything is constantly recorded. Literally everything when you're alone, but it's not recorded by a private entity. It's recorded by an open source entity. So you can see all the sex your politicians are having, and they can see all the sex you're having, and nobody can be like, screw you for having sexual desires. I don't have sexual desires. I'm a political human with a good figure and a good understanding, and I'm a popular adult. When the reality is, people have secrets, people lie, and if people were just recorded all the time in a way where you couldn't delete the recordings, that would do so many good things for our society. A police officer fundamentally acts differently when they know they are being recorded and they cannot get rid of that document. They cannot get rid of that video. All humans act better. I don't care if it's fake. You could say, well, yeah, they only act that way, but they're being fake. Well, you know what? I want those fake people to live in a world where they're never not being recorded, so that it doesn't matter if they're being fake, because eventually that's just going to be who they are. They're going to become the thing that starts out as being fake. I firmly believe that the future of humanity lies on forcing accountability of all parties, politicians, governments, and regular private citizens. Granted, this is a highly unpopular opinion. You listening to this are just thinking I'm a crazy lunatic, and I'm alone in this way of thinking. So, c'est la vie. Let's move forward, see what Reddit has to say about these riots. Denny Benny says, the war was just a part of the protests. We had civil issues that were finally being addressed, riots and protests. We had two highly divided parties that were also much different than the other party. The country's political divide was driven by hate for Nixon. Hey Laddie has a comment about this. He says, I recently spoke to my brother about this. He was just draft age in 1968, and we lived in Chicago. Our family were all against the war. He said our mom didn't want him to even think about going downtown to demonstrate during the Democratic National Convention, and he didn't want to anyway. The scenes they saw on TV from downtown were horrible. Police were clubbing teenagers directly in the face, and so on. It was incredibly violent in 1968, and to my brother's recollection, even worse than the violence we are seeing at some of the protests today. Yeah, I personally agree with that, but again, I'm biased. I traveled the world and wasn't raised in the US, and by the time I was 12, I'd lived in like 5 different countries, so I'm by definition always feeling differently than all the people I'm around who tend to be just raised in one country, unfortunately. But in general, anybody in our generation, if you're listening to this, you have innate freedoms that nobody before you has had. And it is true that there's toxicity, there's intenseness. I'm not saying that everything's fair. I'm not saying the world's fair. But I'm telling you that you have a luxury of being alive when you can utilize technology and the internet to live a good life. There's not actually anything stopping you from earning money online or building some kind of online business and not having any of the issues of finance that you have. The only thing stopping you is yourself and a lack of motivation or a lack of interest or desire or a lack of even knowing that's possible. You hearing me say this are probably like, oh no, that's not possible. Not everyone can do that. And you know what? You're just wrong. You could work online. You could earn money online. You could become your own boss. You could figure out how to earn money doing what you love. If you don't do that, that's on you. But understand that anytime you complain about anything in our modern day, you are being incredibly ungrateful. Because our parents and their parents and their parents had to deal with so much more violence and so much less information and exponentially more disease. If you're scared by how COVID is nothing. COVID is a blip on the radar compared to a blip on the timeline, a blip in history compared to things like tuberculosis or polio. These diseases ravaged humanity Tuberculosis is the #1 killer of all humans in all time. Nothing has killed more humans than tuberculosis. Yet you probably don't even know anybody who died from it. You're so lucky. 100 years ago, you'd probably know 2 or 3 people who were dead by the time you were 8. So, yeah, you can be aware of stuff that's going on, and I'm not saying that things aren't hard, but I'm saying that you have to take everything that's happening with a grain of salt, because it sucks, it's intense, but things were way worse before. Way worse. And if you let yourself believe that things are worse now, oh, the bones of your ancestors are creaking. Oh. And I know this isn't a popular opinion, but I don't care. I'm going to say that anyway. Don't be ungrateful. Be grateful for this amazing life that you have, and figure out what you can do right now to make your tomorrow better. Because unlike most of humanity before us, you have that option. Maybe you don't take it. Maybe you choose to complain, or maybe you choose to get incited about political circumstance and rolled up into that. But you have that option. You have the decision to make. You have the luxury of being able to express yourself. There's so many things you have that humans before only dreamed of. So keep that in mind whenever you get overwhelmed by the negativity. The reality is, we actually have it quite well, guys. I know this year's hard, but I would rather live 2020 every single year for the rest of my life than spend a single week in the 1900s. Early 1900s and 1800s, there was so much death and disease and violence. So much. It truly was hard to escape it. If you were born poor and you didn't have access to a library, which was most people, the chance of you getting the information to open your mind, it was really unlikely. There wasn't a TV that you could see the words on. You couldn't look into the eyes of the face of somebody on the other side of the world. None of that shit was possible. And we take so much for granted in 2020. And it's sad. For me, it's always a point of contention, because my dad died when I was 11, okay? And I'm grateful for that, because that separated me from most people I know. Most people I know complain about their lives. They think that things were better at a certain point. They idolize these points in history that they don't really know that much about. They don't understand how much suffering people have had. People, especially young people that I know, a lot of them are so ungrateful for their lives. They're so bored, and they just fill their boredom by doing drugs because their lives are so boring, and the only way they can make it interesting is by getting thrills off of things that kill them. There's a huge opiate epidemic raging in the country where thousands of people are dying because they don't have something more interesting in their lives than drug addiction. And can you blame them? You know how boring it is to work all day for a company you hate? You know? That's hard. But at the same time, we should be so grateful to be alive. I don't care what's happening right now. If my heart is beating, I can breathe. I can say my opinion. I can express myself. I can talk. I can find people I love and spend time with them. Nobody can stop me. I'm so lucky. And please, I hope if you get anything from this video, which has covered a wide variety of very intense subjects, jeez, please just take that, be grateful for your life. Don't let this stuff convince you that you shouldn't be happy to be alive, because you should be so happy. You don't have tuberculosis. Your little brother didn't die when you were 3. And your little brother didn't have the same name as you because that was so normal that parents named their kids the same thing and had multiple kids. You didn't have to go through that. You didn't have to watch someone get crippled by polio. You didn't have to get an amputation by a doctor who hadn't cleaned the soul he'd amputated with from the cadaver, the dead body he'd just been cutting up. You don't have to deal with any of this, so please stop complaining. Oh my God. All right, everybody. That's it for now. If you like this kind of content, please leave a comment. Let me know what you think, whether it's good or bad. I'm going to cry if you say something bad, but it's okay. That's what the internet's there for. And I have a feeling if anyone watches this, this is the kind of video that antagonizes people. So if you are antagonized, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you angry. I just wanted to maybe get you to think again. You know? Maybe if you think a little bit more, it's okay. I don't mind if you're angry at me if you gave something a second thought. Worth it. All right, everybody. If you want to make this kind of content, reach out to us. Send an email by going to our YouTube channel, clicking on the About, doing the captcha code on the For Business Inquiry section, sending us an email saying hello. We want to have a Zoom call with you. Thanks for watching. See you next time.